Company of Heroes 3 is a strategy game I'm looking forward to immensely and will feature the African and Italian theaters during World War II. Not the Pacific Theater as I hoped and dreamed, but a solid runner-up in the focus of the What If you all sponsored me to create after blowing away 117's donation milestones. So with my setting decided, I thought the most interesting question to ask would be, what if the Axis weren't stopped at El Alamein? What if the Axis actually managed to conquer Egypt? Before I dive in, I'd like to preempt your expectation. This video will actually be 3 separate timelines, as there are a few points where the Axis realistically could have taken Egypt, if things went differently. To make things simple, I'll be starting in the year 1942 and working my way back in time. You'll understand why I did this later on, but without further wait, let's dive in. 1942. Of all 3 scenarios I'll be discussing, this is the most likely time for the seizure of Cairo to have occurred, but it was not a single battle that have accomplished this advance. For the German-Italian army to make it to Port Said, they would need to not just overcome an enemy almost twice in size in men and equipment, but stretch their already dwindling supplies past the breaking point. So for our 42 situation to occur, a decisive victory greater than any which occurred in Africa at the time, happens at El Alamein, allowing the Axis to drive and capture the ports of Said, Suez, and the major cities of Alexandria and Cairo. So the Axis have made it to Egypt, so the question really is now, what now? First and foremost, Egypt. Ruled by the young King Farouk, I can't say he or the Waft-controlled government would be joyous of their new occupiers. Egypt was a neutral nation, shockingly, for a majority of the war, split between neutrality and siding with the Allies. Only at the tail end of the war did they actually declare war on Germany to get a seat at the United Nations. This clash in direction came from the resentment of British oversight, and most Egyptians wanted nothing more than for the British to be gone, replaced by a self-ruled Egypt. Italy, or specifically Mussolini's dream of a Mediterranean empire spanning all the way to Ethiopia, would ensure a free Egypt would never happen. But the British defeat may lead Farouk to stay in the country and side with Italy. Quick tangent, you really should look up the history of of King Farouk. He is an important player for Egyptian nationalism overall, but he really did not like the British, especially in this time frame. In February 1942, the Brits basically threatened his estate via tank barrage. If that doesn't give you a grudge, I can't see what would. Back on topic, Egypt would see itself split between collaborationists and Allied supporters. Numbers and specifics really don't matter, as a little operation called Torch in November 1942 blitzes the African west coast and forces Rommel to pull out, leaving Farouk and anyone that sided with him in a bit of hot water. The diplomatic incident in real terms is the only change between the actual war and the 1942 What If. Malta does have a higher chance of surrendering if Petestrol, now only coming from the Western Med, fails, but realistically nothing significant changes. The only long-term effect would be Farouk's removal as head of state, which means a slight change for Egyptian nationalism, but nothing as major as it would be if the Axis took Egypt in 1941. So it's April 1941. Tobruk is looking like an Australian-led impervious nut to crack, but in this What If, by the unluckiest of circumstances, the city falls. With a nearby logistics hub, the Axis continue their advance, pressing forward until the major cities and towns of northern Egypt are taken by summer 1941. So what are the consequences of this miraculous turn of events? Well, for starters, the British campaign to take Vichy France-controlled Syria isn't enacted, as men and resources would have been diverted to halt Axis troops pouring into northern Egypt. Meanwhile, Malta would be that much further cut off, making its surrender highly likely in 41 or early 42. Lastly, while the British wouldn't have led tanks to King Farouk yet, there is another chance of the Egyptian leadership siding with Axis forces. A dire set of events, but it's also that way for Axis forces. With Germany invading the Soviet Union, Rommel can't count on reinforcements just like in our own timeline, especially since he was originally ordered to hold a defensive position roughly 1,400 kilometers away, and the British, most likely a bit peeved, will be launching offensives at every opportunity from the south or east. Even if Egypt decided to go all in behind the Axis, Italy more than likely would have to be the ones supplying all these new troops under their banner. A tall ask considering how poorly equipped their own men were, meaning that the extra men wouldn't really amount to much. If Rommel does feel confident about launching a new drive, it wouldn't be to the east, it actually would be south. Ethiopia and the Allied campaign to conquer the region lasted until November 1941. Any significant attacks would probably be requested for a southern advance, but the low manpower, lack of reinforcements, the necessary 3,000-kilometer drive south, and mountainous topography would be an untenable task to complete. Any push south is minor and would not reach Ethiopia in time to rescue the stranded Axis forces, so as 1941 ends, I can see a somewhat status quo settling in. Rommel would be physically unable to go anywhere productive, while the UK is unable to break into Egypt from Sudan or the Sinai. So you're probably asking yourself, what exciting events occur in 1942? And the answer is, not great things for the British. Really common theme, actually, now I think about it for this what if. Contrary to what I think you may all expect, the Axis wouldn't break into the Middle East and try to go after the oil fields of Iraq and Kuwait. At least, I don't believe so. The distance between Port Said and Basra is 900 kilometers, the same distance as Benghazi to Port Said. Unlike the latter territory, which could allow for naval reinforcement, a 900-kilometer mad dash into enemy territory without proper supply lines would break down fast. Also keep in mind the two-front situation Rommel has to deal with. If the Axis launch into the Middle East, that would leave the Italians and Egyptians alone to hold off a British drive from southern Egypt. Think Stalingrad, but instead of snow and Soviets, you get a hot and very sad Rommel at the center of this pocket. With all this in mind, Rommel can take the time to drive south and acquire the smaller oil fields close to Hurghada. Any incursion to the east would more than likely be reserved to towns along the Mediterranean or close to it, like Tel Aviv. The other possibility of an eastward drive is to assist Vichy France if the British do decide to eliminate the possible flank. And keep in mind, the British would be attacking, but I doubt they would find success with their own supplies thrown into so much chaos and their lack of a major port in the area. So no major advances on either side for most of 42. What this means is whenever Operation Torch does take place, the Italians have a solid defensive hold on Egypt, so they won't need to pull out immediately. Their navy would also more than likely be in a better situation than in our own timeline. More resources are pushed into the African campaign from both sides. Italy remains fully in the war longer, and the Allied advance is slowed by a factor of months. With the Axis taking Egypt in 1941, I think the two biggest effects would be the following. British history would look upon the war more negatively, as it took an American-led incursion into Africa to finally change Britain's favor in the war. British holdings in the Middle East would also have suffered under foreign occupation. All the sabotaging of the Suez Canal would be economically devastating and take years to correct, leaving Britain and Egypt in a far more dire situation as they both enter a period of decolonization. The second is the effect on Egyptian history. I mentioned economics, but the history of the Arab world without a doubt is altered in this timeline. For instance, if one Gamal Abdel Nasser dies during the Axis occupation of Egypt, no matter what side he's on, he isn't around to lead Egypt through the revolution. He isn't the sole voice arguing for no surrender during the Suez Crisis, which catapulted him into the spotlight of the Arab world. Egypt in this timeline is slower to throw off the shackles of Europe, while the Middle East, depending on where the Germans decide to advance, suffers its own horrors that I dare not go into in this timeline. On that depressing note, let's go back in time, one final time, and see this scenario play out from 1940. So, for the Axis to take Egypt in 1940, one might assume the Italian advance in Egypt in September 1940 would have been successful, and the answer is no. Even if the Italians somehow Mr. Magoo'd their way to the capture of Alexandria, they wouldn't have been able to hold the territory. So for the Axis to capture and maintain Egypt, the Italians listened to their leader in July 1940 and brazenly attack. 250,000 men drive into Egypt and get absolutely destroyed, allowing the meager British to roll a d20, get a 20, and capture the hundreds of thousands of invading Italians. Keep in mind the time frame of when all this is occurring. The Battle of Britain is raging. Germany is hoping to crush the morale of Britain merely for Germany's newest ally, Italy, to give the UK their own Roman triumph. Germany would be forced to send men and planes southward. What meager British units which remain are overwhelmed, and with a considerable amount of luck, Egypt is taken by the end of 1940. Now, I'm going to be very vague going forward, as the act of taking Egypt this early actually does change a lot. First up, Britain would not surrender. Let's get that out of the way real quick. But their presence in the Mediterranean is seriously crippled. With Alexandria removed so quickly, only supply runs from the Western Med can be carried out, leaving Malta and Cyprus seriously hampered, with both possibly surrendering in 1941. Main takeaway, if you're part of the Italian Navy in this what if, you're less likely to be having a bad time. For instance, significant battles like the Battle of Taranto may not happen if the German advance to Egypt is fast enough. Why that is significant is the Japanese used Taranto as a basis for their attack on Pearl Harbor. Note, it wasn't the only basis, and they had planned similar strikes dating back to the 30s. While a shallow water strike would most likely still happen, this what if's December 7th, 1941 could look vastly different from what was carried out in our own timeline. Next up in ramifications is Greece. After suffering such a devastating loss so early in the war, Mussolini more than likely wouldn't order an attack on the Greeks through Albania, even if he desired nothing more than to invade the nation. Greece favored Britain over Germany, but with the former taking over Egypt, Greece would be effectively cut off from any assistance of their preferred nation. So long as Italy doesn't attack and the Greeks can attempt to court Germany, possibly with a pledge of support in the war from their own fascist party, I can see Greece joining the Axis in the same vein as Bulgaria, aka reluctantly. But enough about Europe, let's get back to the Middle East one last time. Of all the scenarios I mentioned previously, this is the one with the highest chance of the Axis making it to Iraq. With Britain knocked out so thoroughly and the Balkan countries either falling or bending the knee, Turkey may allow German supplies and troops to move through their nation, allowing for the capture of British possessions in the Middle East like Iraq with a strong and steady supply line. This wouldn't be an easy conquest, nor one without its own cost and manpower and equipment, but the British would be thoroughly thrown out, which leaves just the Soviets and the Eastern Front. War would still happen in 1941, but keep in mind for the last year, Germany would have expended resources securing the Middle East. Refineries wouldn't be operating at max potential either due to sabotage or British bombings, and men would need to be stationed to bring oil back to Europe. Men that factories need to create weapons, munitions, tanks, etc. Germany's first blow, even if it's better supplied with oil, will still run into the same logistical hurdles it did in our own timeline, as their war machine lacked everything else. Moscow wouldn't be taken in 41. The blow of the German army significantly reduced from their expended effort in the Middle East and in Northern Africa. In 1942, the Axis in this timeline might not even press on the Caucasus mountain range for oil, considering they would have more of their own supply, and instead hope to press on Moscow and win the war. While this is occurring, nothing is stopping the Soviets from launching their own drive through Persia, opening up a second front against the Axis. Without the British to assist in the incursion of Persia, the Soviets could very well take over the nation themselves and press westward. However, this war ultimately ends, and it will end in an Allied victory. It's very likely that the Soviets have a far greater influence not only through Europe, but the Middle East. What if the Axis took Egypt is at its core a math problem? If more energy is used by Italy and Germany against the British, and the UK is forced to expel greater amounts of time, energy, and manpower, the answer to who wins is the side that doesn't change in strength, aka the Soviets. So that is what if the Axis took Egypt. I hope you all enjoyed this what if, and you're interested in a part 2, specifically what if the Soviets took over the Middle East. Let me know in the comments down below. Remember to like and subscribe. I'm Greyshot151, and I will see you all next time. Hopefully with that American what if I've literally been holding off for 2.5 years. 2.5 years. Oh god. In any case, later.
Hello everyone, before y'all go, you can check out more content above, you can subscribe, and you can hear as I talk about some amazing people who support me on Patreon, which include Folkvard, Aphyria, Joey G240, Malam, Ace, ShinobiWarrior, Pyroshark, Sumtool, Epic Pleb. Thank you all for your incredible support. You literally help this channel keep on growing, so thank you. If you want to support the channel, again, check out some of the stuff I mentioned. Otherwise, I'll see all of you next time.